Okay, so our report is called Closing the Gap because we see that there are several gaps in the implementation of the USMCA and the RRM as such. So we wanted to explore all of the developments that we have seen over the past 5 years, in which we have had this very path-breaking rapid response mechanism and start developing some conclusions that could inform the 2026 review, which just started, as Lori mentioned. Just to cover the basics for everyone who might not be super familiar with this mechanism, um, I want to start by highlighting first, this is the first of its kind corporate accountability tool that has been included in a trade agreement. We call it a corporate accountability tool because it allows investigations on individual facilities, that is, workplaces, where workers are denied the rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So the USMCA labor chapter has other labor rights that are protected, but this specific mechanism only protects these two rights. And it covers virtually every sector in the economy but agriculture. So even though the rights scope is limited in terms of like coverage of the economy, is quite expansive. And also it has a requirement that has been called like the trade nexus. Basically, the facilities have to either export or compete with foreign products in order for them to be covered by the mechanism. And it's also novel because the sanctions are imposed at the company level in an escalating system that starts potentially with applying tariffs to the goods that are produced at the specific facility or the services that come from a specific facility to even the denial of entry of those goods to export markets. So it really has some teeth. And that was one of the reasons why companies have really paid attention when they face one of these cases. And the underlying context in which this system appeared is the undeniable decades of wage suppression in Mexico that have contributed to a race to the bottom in North America. For people who are not as familiar with the labor relations in Mexico, there is a widespread problem of what it's called protection unions. These are basically unions that instead of representing workers, they represent the interest of employers. And by 2020, Mexican authorities estimated that around 80 to 85% of all of the collective bargaining agreements that existed in Mexico were protection contracts. So contracts that benefited the employer, that in many cases the workers didn't know that covered their workplaces, and certainly they didn't vote for them. So with the RRM, the USMCA also obligates Mexico to reform its labor laws and institutions. And I would say that that's also something that had been demanded by certain labor unions in Mexico, certain parts of the political society in Mexico for decades. So in 2019, there is this great opportunity for everything to come together to have this kind of system at the supranational level, but also a new labor reform and new labor institutions in Mexico that actually gave opportunities for independent unions to fight against some of these entrenched protection unions that were not properly representing workers. Before going into some of our findings, I want to quickly walk you through what is like the ideal process of an RRM case. And I'm basically focusing my presentation on the US-Mexico system. There is an identical annex for Canada and Mexico that has not been widely used. So our study, our report focuses on the US-Mexico system. First, it starts with a petition that can be filed basically by anyone before the Department of Labor, and that gives the US government, that is Department of Labor and the US Trade Representative Office, 30 days to investigate the complaints. If at the end of the 30 days they determine that there's a good faith belief that there has been a denial of rights at the specific facility, they will ask Mexico to conduct its own review, and Mexico will have 45 days to do so. Mexico can agree with the US and say there are problems of compliance at this facility, and then both governments come together and they negotiate a remediation plan that's formally called a course of remediation. But Mexico says that there are no problems of freedom of association and collective bargaining at this facility, then the US government has the right to go to a panel, and that's a group of 3 labor experts who will determine if there were violations or not, and they will authorize sanctions. The sanctions, as I said, will be tariffs first, even fines or penalties on the goods and services produced by that facility or by that group of companies. And eventually, it could lead, if a company has 3 strikes, that is 3 courses of remediation or 3 negative determinations by a panel, to the denial of entry of their goods to the export market. So, considering that that's the way in which it was designed to work, one of the things that was interesting when we started analyzing the different cases was the green portion of the cases that you see here. So, but let's start. There have been 37 cases launched by June of 2025. Now I think that we're in 39, but that's where our closeout date for the study. So of those 37 cases, 32 had concluded the pre-panel phase by the date, or by the end of June of 2025. 8 of them ended with that formal course of remediation, that agreement between the 2 governments that determines that there were violations and that there are certain actions that need to be taken in order to fix the situation. 6 of these cases went to panels, and of those, there are already 2 panel reports. 2 had other type of outcomes, and basically these are cases in which the US negotiated directly with the company instead of negotiating with Mexico. But 16 of the cases were considered resolved during review. And that's the situation in which the US asked Mexico to review the situation because they found that there was evidence of a denial of rights. And during the 45 days that Mexico had to investigate, the company carried out certain actions, and then Mexico concluded that if there were violations, they were resolved during review. This is problematic because the agreement doesn't really contemplate what are the consequences of a case being resolved during review, whether it counts as a strike in the escalating penalty system that the agreement has. So dealing with this issue is very important because it could be allowing the company to keep its record clean, despite the fact being involved in credible allegations of denial of rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining. Now let's turn to the substantive outcomes of these cases. What we did here is that we basically classified all of the different categories, all of the different remedies that were achieved either through a course of remediation or those that were considered to determine that the case was closed during review or was remediated during review. And we came up with this top 10 of most common remediation actions. And here, what I would like to highlight to begin with is that in 19 cases, that is 2/3 of the cases, workers who were fired for their union activity or the union preferences were reinstated and provided back pay. That is a key development because that really supports workers' rights and workers' ability to fight for their rights. So we think that that has been a very positive development. But also there are certain remedies that over time we have started to notice that don't have the same kind of positive consequences. For instance, the neutrality statement and zero tolerance policy that we see there, they have been included in pretty much every case that did not go to a panel. And that's basically a statement by the company that that it will not interfere with workers' rights and freedom of association liberties. And the zero tolerance policy is an internal policy of the company that management is to abide by the neutrality statement. The issue is that, as was shown by the Atento Servicios panel report, which was one of the 2 cases that had been already decided, In that case, the company had adopted a neutrality statement and a zero tolerance policy, but that did not lead to the stop of union busting behavior. And that was a conclusion of the panel that, in a way, should lead to stronger remedies in cases that have been that could be decided after this one. Lastly, I will also highlight that there are two remedies that are very important for the objectives of actually strengthening union representation and collective bargaining, union access to the facility that only happen in 7 cases, and the obligation on the company to recognize and bargain with the petitioning union that only happened in 5 of the cases. So we would like to see more of that, and some of our recommendations are directed towards that. The lack of the lack of cases that had those kind of remediations could be related to what we see in this graph. Here, basically, based on the public information that we had about the cases and conversations that we had with people involved, we classified all of them in 3 different buckets. The first bucket were the cases then where workers gain union representation, are a new or a revised collective bargaining agreement after filing an RRM case. The second bucket is cases where there was only new union representation. And the third one was when filing an RRM case didn't lead to any of these outcomes. And what you can see is, and the dates there is the date when the case was started. So the cases that started in 2021 and 2022, all of them led to the outcomes that we will consider will be the most transformational ones. New union, new contract, that's what we want. But as we go to 2023 and 2024, more cases are classified in that third bucket. And one thing to note is that the cases that you see that are marked with an asterisk, that means that in those cases, potentially the violations were not related to a struggle to gain a new union. For instance, the Volkswagen case is related to a Puebla plant where an independent union has represented that plant since the 70s. So those were different issues, but those are a minority of the cases. The majority of the cases, there was really a struggle by a minority union, if you will, to try to gain representation and negotiate a new contract, and that has not happened as frequently in recent years. Of course, achieving those results doesn't depend exclusively on the outcomes of an RRM case, but we do believe that there are changes that could be made to the system that will align better the incentives to have better outcomes in terms of representation and bargaining. And finally, regarding our findings, I'm going to go through this very quickly. There's no public information about the total number of petitions that have been filed under the RRM. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request, a FOIA request. And in that way, we discovered that 56 petitions were filed during the first 5 years of the RRM. And that led to the 38 cases that we have been discussing. 38 because there's a case in which we were petitioners, so that's different with the 37 that we had before. But one of the petitions was withdrawn, but the ultimate conclusion here is that there are 19 petitions that were rejected and did not trigger the activation of the mechanisms, and there's no public information about why. And also, when one of these petitions is rejected, the petitioners don't get a written decision explaining the reasons why the case did not move forward. And that has problems for petitioners that want to fine-tune the legal strategies to improve the expectations that they want to file, but also prevents public accountability on the activities of the government. And let me quickly go through some of the recommendations that we have in the report. The first one is shorten the respondent's party period for internal review. As I said, right now Mexico has 45 days. It should be 30. The US practice shows that it's possible to do these investigations in 30 days, and that might help not having as many cases resolved during review and still have like the more holistic approach of having like a formal course of remediation. Second, this is related to how the mechanism is implemented in US law, but basically there is a deadline of 60 days that makes that the US government has to determine whether to invoke a panel 60 days after it has activated the mechanism. We are concerned that that could be forcing the government to forego the option of going to a panel even before they know that there's real remediation at this facility. Third, it will be great if there's greater obligation from the government to consult with the stakeholders and particularly the petitioners when they are developing remediation actions, and to actually and of course they can disclose the result of the investigations without harming or putting in peril the workers. And the fourth, targeted adjustment, and we call these targeted adjustments because we think that it's just changing a part of the agreement, not like actually like something that will require a lot of work. Um, will be clarifying that a resolved during review outcome is a denial of rights determination for the three strike system. But going into systemic improvements is something that would actually require more than just like changing something in the agreement. I will just announce that it will be good to add a substantive obligation requiring all USMCA parties to ensure employers bargaining in good faith. Mexican law currently doesn't have that explicitly, and it will be useful because in certain RRM cases that has been a limitation. Second, the Federal Center for Labor Conciliation and Registration, this new institution that was created by the 2019 reform, doesn't have a clear sanctioning authority. There is a bill in the Mexican Congress to provide that kind of authority. Having it in the trade agreement might support moving forward that bill. And third, if we really want to have a system that is transformational and that sets the stage for other potential regional agreements, it will be great if we could have a system that has an independent, neutral body that takes care of the investigation and that applies equally among the three countries. And here we draw some inspiration, for instance, of the US-Cambodia textiles agreement that was negotiated in 2004, where the ILO was recruited by the US government to take care of some of these monitoring functions. But let me stop there